So the House versus NCAA case came to a settlement finally, but we still have a ton of questions. Lucky for us, we're going to get most of them answered today. This is Always Talking Ball. Tyler Noe, Lance Barton, and joining us today is a man that I've known for nearly 30 years, one of my good buddies, still to this day, current attorney at Church, Hittle, and Antrim in Indianapolis, Indiana, and former Northwestern Wildcat, Mr. James Nussbaum. James, thank you so much for joining us today.
That's probably the best introduction I've ever gotten, so thank you for that. But yeah, looking forward to it. I'm not sure we'll answer all the questions, but we can at least point out some more.
Yeah, and Tyler, I gotta think that James here, being a Northwestern grad, probably knows a little bit more about this than an Alabama grad here. They're kind of equal education, I would feel like, but yeah, I think James might have a little bit more to know about this on the settlement. So appreciate you joining us here today, James.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Lance.
So I mentioned, obviously you played for the Wildcats back in the day, but just give us a rundown of your background for people watching or listening. Let them know you're not just some random dude we're having on the podcast, that you're actually qualified to talk about this stuff a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Like Tyler said, played football at Northwestern, wanted to stay involved in college athletics. So after a year of working finance in Chicago and realizing that wasn't my life's calling, decided to go to law school. And really, since law school, have been working in college athletics, worked in compliance and with the NCAA while I was in law school. And then immediately after I graduated, went and worked at Indiana University. So I was in-house as one of their general counsels for 8 years, advising all their athletics departments. So their NAIA schools, their 2 Division I programs, the campus formerly known as IUPUI in Indiana University. And then in 2022, joined CCHA. So Kelly Fagan here had launched a sports law practice. We had actually hired her when I was at Indiana University to help us with some pretty high profile matters. And she said, hey, would you ever want to come over and work in private practice on this side and work with a lot of clients? So that's what we do. I am also doing leading our general higher education practice, so outside of sports law. And we do this work all day, every day. So clients from California to Connecticut and everywhere in between, trying to help people figure out how to implement the House settlement and be compliant with all of the crazy regulations that they're trying to deal with.
Nice. So obviously we would be, prefer to be talking about games on the field, teams, all that stuff. But, this stuff keeps happening in college athletics. So we got to talk about it. So, and it can be tough to understand for most people that are watching or listening. So Michael Scott style here, explain all of this to us like we're 8 years old. Like what are maybe your 2 to 3 biggest takeaways from the stuff that came out?
Yeah, so big picture, prohibition on paying student athletes has kind of been a fundamental tenet of the NCAA. It's taken on different forms. It's taken on different names. Most recently, it's been referred to as amateurism, but many of the enforcement scandals, recruiting scandals, all boil down to paying student athletes. And a big component of this lawsuit was saying this is an antitrust violation. Schools can't all get together and agree we're not going to pay student athletes because that's un-American. That's not free market. You should be able to pay student athletes. And so 3 different cases were all consolidated into one, and the 2 parties came to a settlement agreement. There's 3 big components to that settlement agreement. Looking backwards, student athletes, after me, I just missed the cutoff, but student athletes for about 10 years are going to receive in the neighborhood of $2.6 billion worth of damages. Going forward, schools can pay student athletes up to a certain amount of money for the use of their name, image, and likeness. We can talk about that in more detail if you want. And then third, we're replacing the scholarship limits that the NCAA used to have with roster limits. So you can give as much scholarship or as little scholarship money as you want, but there are specific roster limits for every sport. And that's been litigated for a few years now. And then just late Friday night, Judge Wilkin in California approved the settlement that the 2 sides had come to agreement on. And it's all set to go into effect on July 1st. So we're moving pretty quickly here.
Yeah, James, appreciate you sharing that. And I've been seeing some stuff on about, that figure being thrown around that that has been settled on, that these universities are allowed to directly pay. Just crazy to think, man. I'm sure in your world of working that, with the NCAA and whatnot, that now universities being able to directly pay student athletes going forward. And it looks like that number starting out is going to be $20.5 million. That programs can pay all of their student athletes across all sports. Will that number increase over time? I think there's in the contract that number is going to be increasing over time, but starting out it's $20.5 million, right?
That's right, and it will increase. It's modeled after some professional collective bargaining agreements and how they do the revenue share for pro sports. So there's a calculation where all this revenue that schools and conferences are getting will be put into a pool, and then 22% of that is, or the average of 22% of that is the number that ultimately is that 20.5 million for this year that you're talking about. So as ticket revenue increases, or more importantly, as TV revenue increases, that number is probably going to go up. That right now the settlement has a 10-year time frame, and they're projecting that it'll be in the 30 million range by the end of that 10-year frame.
And do these programs I've already had people asking me, so what is programs in the MAC, or the Oregon States and Wazoo, Washington States, who kind of got left behind in the Pac-12. I know they're forming a new Pac-12 now as we're speaking, but what those programs do they have the 20.5 million, or do they have to pay 20.5 million? How does that work with some of these smaller programs?
Yeah, so the Power Four conferences were actually defendants in these lawsuits. And so as part of the settlement, if you're a Power Four conference, you have to opt into the terms of the settlement. That doesn't mean that you have to pay the full 20.5 million, but it means you agree to all the other provisions of the settlement. Mm-hmm. Every school can choose how much or how little of that new salary cap essentially to pay. Below that, schools can decide if they want to be in the settlement or they don't want to be in the settlement. MAC schools, for example, I think most of them are choosing to opt in. If you go kind of a half step below that to the Horizon League or some of the other kind of low major conferences, I think it really is school by school, not even conference by conference, where some schools are opting in and some are not. So it's really, that's one of the questions that we've dealt a lot with especially schools that don't have big time power football, which I know is what you guys talk a lot about. I think it's not a slam dunk that they should opt in and be subject to the roster limits and some of these other provisions.
So NILs and collectives, a lot of questions obviously surround what exactly does a collective do, all that stuff. What's going to happen with these NIL collectives? You talked about, the clearinghouse and the $600, maximum that they can pay before it has to go to that clearinghouse. What's the deal with the collectives right now?
Yeah, most schools, not all schools, most schools are keeping their collective because it's sort of core to college athletics, unfortunately, that as soon as there's a rule, everybody tries to figure out how to work around it. And in this case, that was happening before the settlement was even approved. So there's kind of three different payment mechanisms. You can pay the kids directly from the school. That goes under the $20.5 million. But especially for these high major Power Four football programs, they're already trying to figure out how can we pay these kids outside of that cap because we want to exceed that amount. And that's where collectives are going to come into play. There's kind of two different categories outside of the school. So there's the first category is called associated entities or associated individuals. If you're thinking old school NCAA terms, those are boosters. Those are probably your collectives. That's what you're talking about, Tyler. If those entities are paying student athletes, they have to disclose that. And then it's going to go through this process where Deloitte is trying to determine, are these fair market value contracts? How they're going to determine that, I think, is still unclear. But if it's not a fair market value, the party and the student would have to go and renegotiate to come into fair market value or face eligibility penalties. They can go to arbitration, but that's where this new college sports commission that you're hearing about is going to be enforcing those types of rules, taking that away from the NCAA. If you're asking my unvarnished opinion, I think it's going to look a lot like the NCAA in a different with a different name and a different leader, but they're enforcing those same types of payment prohibitions that we've seen for decades in college athletics. And then the third category is companies that are wholly unassociated with the student athlete. Those are your like Cooper Flag is sponsored by New Balance, and they can do those deals. Student athletes can receive fair market value of whatever those amounts would be.
Okay, so one of the questions we got from one of our followers on X, Squad Blitz, and it kind of goes along with the College Sports Commission, but they want to know if anyone has the ability to regulate these decisions, because the NCAA sure doesn't seem to be able to in the past. And then like when you're talking about fair market value, right? And it gets to this thing where, Arch Manning gets a deal for $2 million, right? And say, oh, that's not fair market value. How long is this process going to take? Like these decisions are going to take? Because in the past, you've seen decisions, under NCAA rule, it just seems like it just drags on forever. But like these guys got to play, they got to choose what school they're going to. Like it all depends. So like how quickly are these decisions going to be made?
Yeah, I'm really skeptical on your first question, if there's an entity that can actually enforce this. I think they're going to be susceptible to the same type of lawsuits that the NCAA was. They've tried to build some guardrails around that we can get in the weeds on. It's not terribly exciting, but I don't know that in the long run they're going to be immune from those lawsuits unless Congress comes in and passes a statute that gives them immunity. And we've already seen several states that have created their own state laws saying that these schools in their states can pay student athletes and they can't be prohibited from doing that. So they're already against some of these state laws that are going to conflict with the provisions of the settlement. On the second question, Deloitte has said that they'll be able to turn these agreements around in a day or a little bit more. Again, I'm a little bit skeptical of that. And if they turn it around and the parties disagree and then you're going through arbitration, that's not a short process either. So again, it feels similar to what we've been doing for a while, just with a different gloss over it.
Yeah, James, this is really for our listeners too, like for, education purposes, and really for me, I just want to make sure that I understand this part of it fully, because this is, I think, a part that most people have questions about. So outside of the $20.5 million cap, NIL or booster involvement or third-party involvement, whatever that may be, currently going forward, how it's supposed to work is that if there is anything over that key number of $600 that is offered to a student athlete, the process is it has to pass through a clearinghouse, which in this case is Deloitte.
Yep.
And then this College Sports Commission, who is the governing arm that is taking over, the NCAA is no longer involved. This College Sports Commission, who I think the commissioner or the CEO of this is the former MLB executive Brian Seeley. He reports to the power commissioners, the power conference commissioners, and it has to pass through Deloitte and then pass through this and pre-approved by this College Sports Commission before the athlete can receive whatever those funds are over $600. Is that correct? Is that how that works?
Yeah, there's one more step in between there. So if Deloitte denies that it's fair market value, the parties don't agree to renegotiate, they can take it to a neutral arbitrator. So a third party that hears this, it's sort of like a protracted lawsuit. And the arbitrator can say thumbs up or thumbs down, this meets fair market value. And if they're still saying it doesn't meet fair market value, that's when that College Sports Commission would come in and enforce against the provision of the dollars from that agreement.
Okay.
But otherwise, you got it exactly right.
Yeah. Good job, Lance. That's Alabama education for you.
Yeah,
But
well,
again, I mean, that's the rule is that you have to disclose any agreement that's over $600. But if somebody drops a bag full of cash at your mom's house, that might not get disclosed. I know that's a crazy idea, and we've never heard of anything like that. But it's going to be a similar thing where people are just figuring out how to work around the rules.
yeah, Jeremy Pruitt at Tennessee was before his time with some of this stuff. But we still might have some of those under the table McDonald's bags or Chick-fil-A bags full of cash going on again. What do you think is going to happen to? Like, I heard a lot of questions on many different shows and a lot of people, on social media. What do you think is going to? What do you personally think is going to happen to the non-revenue generating sports and some of these Olympic sports at a lot of these universities?
Yeah, they're depending on what, or you can call it different things, but the funding towards those sports is going to go down. I mean, it's a fixed pie. We've already seen schools start to cut sports, or one of the euphemisms you'll hear sometimes is they're going to tier sports, which means they're just not going to fund them at the same level that they're funding some of the higher sports, whether it's through scholarships, whether it's through equipment that they receive, all the supports that our student athletes get. It's just a reality because most of these schools don't have $20 million sitting around, and they got to find a way to compete. Because if you can't compete in football and men's basketball, then you're not able to run an athletic department. And so schools are already trying to do that. I think it's just going to increase. There are a lot of Title IX implications related to that we advise people on. A lot right now as people are trying to figure out how to balance all these interests. But in the long run, I think a lot of people thought that was sort of Chicken Little, like doomsday, the sky is falling. But we're already seeing it in schools across the country.
Yeah, and you just mentioned a key phrase there, keyword there, Title IX. I'm sure lawsuits will be coming eventually, but again, based off my just limited knowledge on this, James, is this new settlement, is it subject to any Title IX implications whatsoever, and having to like equally pay women's sports and like athletes in women's sports as opposed to men and men's sports in college athletics?
Yeah, again, we can go as long as you want on this. I could talk to you until 5 o'clock tonight, but the short answer is money going to student athletes from educational institutions that receive federal funding is subject to Title IX. How that plays out remains to be seen. When Title IX was written 53 years ago, they weren't ready for this. They weren't anticipating that student athletes were going to be paid millions of dollars. So it doesn't fit neatly into most of the frameworks. I think there's a couple of different directions that it could go, and schools are trying to figure out how they want to balance those risks. The judge in the House settlement was very clear that she wasn't ruling on Title IX. It wasn't a Title IX lawsuit. Nothing. She wasn't saying whether the solutions or the provisions of the agreement were compliant with Title IX or not. She was very clear of that. So I think that's the next wave of litigation. There's a couple of cases pending right now that aren't specific to the House settlement, but are related to it. And there are attorneys across the country. They're getting ready to file lawsuits as soon as these payments start to be made.
We had a question come in, not really about college football per se, but like some of those schools that are like basketball only, like mostly Big East, right? You got Marquette and Xavier and some of those schools. How does this affect them? I mean, are they just going to be able to put a ton of money towards basketball since they don't have football? It's like dominate the sport.
Yeah, I think that's a narrative that's been pushed forward. I don't buy it for two reasons. One, the TV deals for the Power Four conferences are so much more money that they have the money to pay the student athletes, and that's driven by football. That's why they have the money. So I'm not sure that's a big problem for the Big East. The second problem is it assumes that everybody's actually going to abide by the cap, which I don't think is. I mean, we've already heard schools. I read a report this morning that Texas Tech is going to pay $55 million to its student athletes this year. Remember, the cap is $20.5 million. So assuming everybody was playing by the rules and assuming everybody had the same amount of money, it would seem to favor the Big East, but I don't think either of those assumptions are true.
We saw recently, probably a month or so ago, that Kentucky's athletic department officially became its own LLC. This is something that I think other athletic programs are going to be looking at, no doubt. I mean, we've already kind of seen a couple, programs be floated around, talking about private equity and stuff. But explain to everyone why it would be beneficial for a university athletic department to go this route.
Yeah, and we've even encouraged schools to think about it. I think it just provides you additional flexibility, especially for a state institution like Kentucky. There are all sorts of provisions that are state specific statutes that dictate how state government runs. And a lot of those apply to state institutions, to public institutions too, like Kentucky. And so if they have a third party, even if it's wholly owned, that they can assign their intellectual property rights to, that they can do some of these deals with, it just gives you more flexibility. It provides potentially a liability shield if there are things that the athletics department is sued for that's separate from the institution. So it just gives you a lot of options. I think it makes you pretty nimble. And in this changing landscape, we don't really know where all of these things are going. So if you can give yourself some extra flexibility, I think it's worth looking into. Again, that's all going to be state specific. I think Kentucky looked at their state laws and their situation and said, hey, this is the best decision for us right now. But I'd be shocked if we don't see it from more schools going forward.
James, in your own opinion of this, like, where do you think we're going next from here? Like, is this just, do you think this House versus NCAA settlement and this $20.5 million cap, and it's going to grow a little bit more over time as TV money grows, and that's just, and then we have this governing arm with the College Sports Commission, and that's it going forward? Or where do you see this going forward? What's the next steps from here?
Yeah, and I should have started with my general caveat of all of my opinions are mine and not my law firm, and I'm not giving legal advice. I think it ends with student athletes being employees. They're paid to play sports. We've sort of come up with this facade where we say, well, it's really about their publicity rights. But at the end of the day, if Cooper Flagg goes to Duke and is a econ major and never plays basketball, his NIL isn't worth anything to Duke. He's paid to play basketball, and that looks a lot like employment. So I don't know how we don't end up there. I think schools and presidents of schools are hesitant to do that because it's such a different framework than what we've worked in for a long time. But I think we end there. I think we end with some version of collective bargaining. The big impediment to that right now is trying to figure out how to work all of these state institutions under one umbrella, right? Because again, different states have different laws on unionization and striking and how that would work so that Alabama is on the same footing as Purdue University. I think we have to work through that. But I think we're going to have athletes at the table bargaining with management in a way that looks a lot more like professional sports than having a settlement of an antitrust claim dictate how college sports works.
Yeah, James, I think you just hit it on the head there that a lot of folks in collegiate athletics, like the casual fan, just doesn't realize that, why can't they just collectively bargain like the NFL or pro sports? And you've got just, in the low 30s of teams in the NFL that are all their own entities, businesses underneath one entity in the NFL, a lot different than 100 something, Division I football programs or even more in the basketball and baseball across the entire country. It's hard to collectively bargain when you've got that many institutions like that with everybody subject to state law and everything like you just said.
Yeah, even if you're just bargaining within football, even if it's just the SEC, you have 6, 8 different states. Texas is very different than Florida. It's very different than Kentucky. And then you have Vanderbilt, which is a private entity. And you how all those work together from a bargaining standpoint is complex. And I think they have to figure out how to work that solution. And you can't come up with a solution that Texas can then just pass a law that suddenly gives their football teams a one-up over everybody else. So there's got to be a solution there. But I think it it's the simplest solution. It's going to make sure that student athletes are compensated appropriately. I just think that's where we end up.
All right. Before we let you go, I know we're a couple months out. You played college football. I know you've been following this part of it, but we got to get your take on the Wildcats this year, the Big Ten. Like, what do you see for college football in 2025? Like, what are you looking for?
I'm a big Big Ten fan. I know that gets me in dangerous water on this podcast probably, but I'm excited. I'm excited for this year. The Cats got a lot of good momentum. I'm still, to be perfectly candid, still miss Coach Fitz and all the great things he did for Northwestern. But what they got going there seems like they have good momentum. I don't want to make any predictions, but I think they're going to bounce back a little bit this year and have some positive momentum. I'll say I'm not going to make a prediction. I'll hold off on that. I think Northwestern will be better.
You got any predictions for our boy TB in Michigan?
Gosh, I'm not gonna step into that either. He's probably listening and will get frustrated if I say anything negative about Michigan. Michigan has other problems to handle right now. They got a lot going on with the NCAA, so they figure that out. They'll probably have a good year.
Yeah, you got any insight on that? Like on just kind of what the NCAA is going to do with Michigan?
No, I mean, again, I think they have been over the last 2 or 3 years. It just seems like every time they come down with a big decision, somebody files a lawsuit, and so I think they've been a little bit hesitant to take bold moves. I would be surprised if it's pretty drastic here, just because they have been, they've just been so beat down in the lawsuits that they've had.
Yeah,
I think we should see something soon, though. I think the hearing was pretty recently.
Okay. Well, man, I appreciate you coming on. This is fun. This is fun for me to have an old buddy on. I know Lance. He's got that Alabama education, like he mentioned. So to get a little knowledge from a professional is good for him. I mean, me too, with the Liberty education. So we appreciate you coming on, man. Appreciate everybody listening and watching out there. And we will see you guys next time.